This video is a short introduction to the topic of how, when and why teachers may make use of languages other than English in the English language classroom, often commonly referred to as using the L1, the mother tongue, or the learner's own language. For the majority of the 20th century, language teaching methodology promoted approaches that largely excluded other languages from the classroom, sometimes called monolingual or English-only approaches. However, this began to change in the 1990s, and the rationale underpinning such approaches has been questioned and even critiqued as inappropriate for the majority of teachers around the world who share a language other than English with their learners. Many such teachers have always continued to make use of the L1 in their teaching, despite the monolingual paradigm that predominated for many years. More recently, academics have argued that language teaching is currently undergoing a multilingual turn, a paradigm shift of sorts away from monolingual approaches, as we re-evaluate our understanding of what language is, how it develops, and how it is used in wider society. Today, while there are a wide range of opinions on this topic, the consensus supports the belief that, when done appropriately, the use of other languages, both by teacher and learners, can support, scaffold, and facilitate language learning effectively at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. However, differences in these and other contextual factors always need to be taken into consideration. Important contextual factors are always likely to influence both the need for and the usefulness of other languages in the English language classroom. These include the age of our learners, their proficiency in English, and the intended outcomes of a course or curriculum. Although the single most important factor to consider in this area is whether we teach a bilingual or multilingual class. In bilingual classes, one other language is shared by most, if not all, of the learners, and can be used effectively as an alternative to English in a range of ways, including by the teacher, providing, of course, that they also share this language. The alternative to this is a multilingual class, where learners have different first languages and therefore classroom communication has to take place in English, although even in such multilingual classes, other languages can still be used productively, albeit in a more limited number of ways. Another very important contextual consideration is the learner's age and educational context. Younger learners, particularly in mainstream primary education, are often facing challenges of initial literacy, both in their L1 and other foreign languages like English. Drawing upon their known resources, including the L1, will often be necessary to support the development process. This support may need to continue for English into secondary education in many contexts around the world, particularly if their first language uses a different written script to English. At higher levels of education, also corresponding to older age groups, literacy becomes much less of an issue and we can focus on other areas. A number of research studies have provided useful insights into how teachers around the world make use of other languages in the classroom. Let's look at some of these drawn from research by Graham Hall and Guy Cook, involving over 2,700 teachers around the world. The most important finding of this study was that L1 use was widespread. Let's look at teacher use of the L1 first. Many teachers make use of it in an explaining role, most often to explain or translate vocabulary, or to explain grammar or other complex concepts to their learners. Many also use it for what we might call interpersonal functions, to develop rapport, build a good atmosphere, and to maintain order in the classroom. Some teachers reported using the first language to give instructions to learners and to provide feedback to learners on their spoken language use and written work. A number of teachers also found it important to raise learners' awareness of differences between languages, for example in contrastive analysis of grammar between L1 and English. With regard to learner use of the L1, almost all teachers reported that their learners made use of bilingual dictionaries for translating vocabulary. They also compared English grammar to the grammar of their first language to help them to understand it. A small number of teachers also reported that their learners used L1 while preparing for activities that they are about to do in English. This might be in the form of personal note-taking or pair and group work discussions in the L1. Other uses mentioned included learners using subtitles when watching audio-visual material in English to help them to understand it, and the use of written or spoken translation activities, although these were less common. The term translanguaging has recently become prominent in the research literature on multilingualism as a new way of looking at how two or more named languages are used in close conjunction in society. While translanguaging includes practices historically described as code switching and code mixing, it seeks to see these practices less as switching between two separate systems and more as the natural use of a single integrated system. It is well documented that in many highly multilingual societies around the world, for example in India, Kenya, Nigeria, and also in many multicultural communities in large cities, languages are not necessarily used separately, but are often integrated pragmatically during social interaction, depending on who we are talking to, what we are doing, and our intentions. The potential implications of translanguaging for the language classroom are many. To explore just one, if the use of English in local society involves its integration into wider language use practices, then what happens in our classrooms, both in terms of aims and the ways we use language, may need to move closer to this rather than assuming that learners will need to use English predominantly monolingually in their futures. An important consequence of this is that, in contrast to past eras, when it was often assumed that monolingual, English native speakers were the best models for language learners, a translingual perspective allows us to envisage an alternative to this, in which the most appropriate teachers, the best models for multilingual learners, are those who are able to translanguage with English effectively, modelling and replicating what are natural and effective language use practices in wider society in the classroom. When considering ways to make use of L1 in your classroom, firstly be aware of curriculum guidelines and policy. In some contexts, the use of other languages is encouraged. In others, it isn't allowed. Secondly, there's a lot of research on L1 use practices, and you may want to find out how teachers use L1 in your country. Is there any evidence that certain practices facilitate learning more effectively? Finally, you could conduct an action research project in your classroom. For example, you could try introducing a new strategy that makes a different use of L1 and then interview your learners to find out their opinions on this strategy. Here are some resources currently freely available to support teachers interested in making productive use of other languages in the classroom. And remember that because of the numerous differences between two classes, even in the same country and educational system, what works in someone else's class won't necessarily work in yours. So always be critical when interpreting both research evidence and the advice and opinion of others, including mine.